Welcome back to our book lectures for the Festival of Economics in Trento. Today we will speak about a very important book that came out this year, Robert Schiller, about narrative economics, how stories go viral and drive major economic events. It was published now in English by Princeton University Press, and it will come out in Germany this week. So we're very happy to speak about this very interesting book with one of the most important German economists, with Lars Feld. He is the director of the Walter Eucken Institute in Freiburg, and he's also the president of the Sachverständigenrat, which is this group of 5 economists that advises the government. So welcome, Professor Feld. We're very happy to have you here.
Welcome, Tonia. I'm happy to be with you.
Okay, and so Robert Schiller is, of course, a very famous economist. He's a Nobel laureate, and he teaches in Yale. But he became much more famous when the 2007 financial crisis, came out, because he was one of the few economists who had predicted this in a certain sense. Schiller has always been challenging the idea of this Homo economicus, or maybe the Germans would call him now a Fachidiot. So someone who is close in his economic bubble, and he's always been skeptical about the efficiency of markets, which is one of the most important pillars of his theory. So also of its rationality. And so thanks to the behavioral studies, which he used a lot, and thanks to this beliefs that he has always been teaching also, he has been able, of course, to predict a crisis which was predictable, the stock market bubble of 2007, that was, of course, that exploded because of a housing market which was totally insane. In his latest book, Narrative Economics, I would say, I don't know if Professor Feld is with me, he spins his thought even further. So he analyzes something which is not taken into consideration enough in Schiller's opinion, which is narrative. What is narrative? Stories. He says, since ancient Greece or ancient times, human beings are telling stories, and sometimes these stories pop up in a very violent way, and they influence economic in a very strong way. So before going into some details of this, I think, very important book, I would say that one of the main things that we can bring with us, having read the book, is that the economists, this is what Schiller says, should incorporate much more this contagion narrative into economic theory. So I would start from this, Professor Feld, because Schiller admits that it's very difficult to not to predict a story that will influence the economy, so a narration, a constellation, or a narrative.
Yeah, perhaps I can start with the 3 remarks. First of all, you said that Schiller is famous for his behavioral finance approach. And when you think about the year he got the Nobel Prize, he got it together with Eugene Fama, which is on the other side of the spectrum, saying that financial markets are always efficient. It was quite a wise decision by the Nobel Prize Committee to award both of them this prize. And because this is showing 2 different ends of the spectrum. And what I feel in this narrative economics book by Schiller, he's even going a bit further. He's stretching the behavioral approach very much to a certain end. When you think about the Homo economicus model, usually narratives would be classified as cheap talk, nothing else. So people talk about something, but if there's no substance behind it, it shouldn't make any difference, according to the Homo economicus. And we already know from many from many laboratory experiments in behavioral economics that talking to each other plays a strong role, whether it is signaling, whether it is preparing cooperation or whatever. So Schiller has a good point here, but saying that he stretches it very far is meaning it's difficult, and he also admits that it's difficult to find out what a narrative actually is, finding it out in advance, whether a narrative will influence economic outcomes. And it's also very difficult to test properly the impact of narratives, given that there is always the discussion about causation and directions of causation going on. This is some of the aspects Schiller discusses in his book, and I think it's also a very important aspect, and we can, we should, I think, in this podcast talk about these problems in particular. My second remark I would like to make is that Schiller in his narrative economics is showing masterly across time how different narratives emerged and how they influenced outcomes. Yeah. But what he's also always showing is that these narratives are connected with particular events. And so it is usually the interaction between the event as such and the way people are talking about it. I say people, but it's to a large extent media as well. So there is a relation to the impact of media on economic outcomes that is somewhere in the literature. And I think this is also something we should talk about. And the third remark I would like to make is Schiller in this book, I think somehow it is going a bit too far in the sense that he is giving high importance to narrative. Of course, he wants to make this point in the book that narratives are important, but he cannot demonstrate, I think, conclusively in the end how dominant they actually are. Whether it is not to a large extent the event as such, so the economic basis that plays a role. I think this is something we should keep in mind as well.
Mm-hmm. I would go a little bit into the book because I think one of the most interesting details, one of the most interesting stories he tells here is really a sort of legend. This is the Laffer curve legend, or yes, story, and which explains a lot of things that I think he tries to demonstrate in the book. First, the Laffer curve story dates back to 1974, where there is this dinner, and this economist Art Laffer draws this Laffer curve on a napkin, and this becomes one of the strongest narrative of Reaganomics later, of the economy, of the neoliberal economy. Professor Feld, I would invite you to tell us a little bit about this story, because there is a lot that Schiller says. First, about the fact that the moment the legend or the story is born is not necessarily the moment that the story has an effect on the economy, because this comes almost 10 years later. Why? Tell us about this Laffer story. I think it's
first of all, I think it's important to say what the Laffer curve is. It is saying that we have an inverse U-shaped relation between the tax rate and tax revenue. And this is quite intuitive. When you think about low tax rates and you increase the tax rate, then the tax revenue increases, because the incentives, the negative incentives imposed by the tax rate are not so dominant. But when you already have high tax rates and you increase the tax rate further, then the Laffer curve says tax revenue could decline just because the negative incentives become dominant. So one example where it is studied in more recent times is the tobacco tax, for example. And tobacco taxes have been strongly increased in recent times. And what you now observe is that, well, on the one hand, people smoke less, but on the other hand, also the avoidance, the ways of avoiding the tax are used more frequently, such that the overall tax revenue does not increase anymore with this tax rate. And the lever curve debate was saying, well, the US already is on the right arm of the lever curve, with tax rates being too high, and when we are reducing the tax rates, then tax revenue increases, and we have an additional financing of the government, of the state. That was that was what the lever curve is saying. So it is a, so to speak, a stylistic way of representing this relation between tax rate and tax revenue. On the one side, it is a nice story because Lever obviously wrote that on draw through the lever curve on a napkin in this restaurant, and the napkin is also somewhere in a museum in the US, so it can be proven that that it exists.
And Laffer says that he doesn't remind this moment. So this is one of the most interesting aspects, no?
Yes. And what Schiller is showing us is, first of all, that you needed to have someone prominent to take this story up, airing it in the general public and discussing it further. And the general public took it up and discussed it further. So there is a time lag between the drawing of the lever curve in 1974 and the Reagan campaign taking it up, and then finally also using it for discussing its or for preparing its fiscal policy in the 1980s. A combination of tax cuts on the one side and expenditure increases on the other side, mainly for defense. This was what Reagan did. And well, some people in the US hoped that still the deficit would be reduced by this kind of policy, but it was clear that it couldn't because the US was not on the right hand of the lever curve. It was on the left hand of the lever curve. So it's quite interesting to see that with respect to narrative economics, one factor that is important is that someone who is prominent is taking up a story, that this story is made digestible for general public. So it is translated in simple words and simple relations, and then that the media are taking up this idea and distributed it. Schiller uses the allegory of epidemics to show how news spread across the world or across time. So he has this kind of contagion, the idea of contagion that plays a role here. And it's quite interesting that he uses this metaphor of epidemics in these times. The book was written before the Corona crisis, but it shows us gives us quite interesting insights as well in that regard.
And this is what's also interesting. He makes an analysis of fake news, no? And he also shows the resilience of fake news or of a certain narrative, which is resisting also the truth. So, for example, going back to the Laffer curve, I mean, Reagan, he cut the taxes, no, on wealthy people from 70% to 28%. So he reduced a lot of this tax rate, marginal tax rate, so especially for rich people. And nevertheless, during the 80s, this is what Schiller says, some narrative about the tax harming, in a certain sense, the economy. They survive in the American narrative. For example, the story about the Swedish, very heavy taxes with which, for example, Ingmar Bergman was harassed, or I mean, this is also a very interesting aspect. He says this narrative is so strong sometimes that when there's a counter narrative which is fact-based, it can't really impose itself on the fake narrative, no?
Yeah, that's one of the insights of this book, saying that despite facts are different, a narrative survives in some circumstances. What I think Schiller neglects to some extent in this book, or does not make very explicit is the political interest behind certain narratives. And I think that this political interest, whether it is a government or a political party or a certain interest groups, whatever political influence you might look at, the political interest plays a strong role in sustaining narratives that even are false. So this idea, well, the example of Sweden with Ingmar Bergman on the one side, Astrid Lindgren on the other side, well, this is very instructive because you have marginal income tax rates above 100%. And then it is quite clear that the incentive not to work further is to work an additional hour, that the incentive is very low. So it's a negative incentive that is very strong, not to work an additional hour. But the problem is the more differentiated view that people need to add in such discussions and in such narratives. For example, with respect to taxation and the Laffer curve, that there's also an interplay between the tax rate and the tax base. Such differentiations usually are not taken up by a general public because things are becoming too complicated, and the simple stories, they prevail as well. So when you have a simple story that sounds convincing and there is a political interest behind it, I think narratives are very, very important. This also, you could also translate that to other circumstances. We are now talking about the influence of narratives on economics, but we have narratives in many, many different circumstances. In 2017, I organized a conference here in Freiburg, unfortunately only in German, on the impact of storytelling and narratives. And we had a very interdisciplinary discussion, also with social psychologists, with people being in literature and so on. And they were telling us the prevalence of fake news in the sense of narrative that is very difficult to overcome, also in these micro circumstances. I'll give you an example. Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, is internationally, but in particular in Germany, thought of being relatively close to National Socialist ideology. This is some of the narratives that is still prevailing in Germany. But when you look at his
abroad,
also abroad, yes. But when you look at his philosophy, this is very difficult to sustain. The narrative came up because his sister, the sister of Nietzsche, wanted to be as close to the National Socialists as possible, and therefore also changed some of the writings of Nietzsche. So she fixed that up and made it up in order to be accepted by the political party, in order to be within this area of the powerful in Germany. And well, still it prevails. Also, history and science has shown that the narrative regarding Friedrich Nietzsche is wrong, and still the narrative is dominating. And you could also have that in other circumstances. It's quite interesting to see what's going on here, and it's interesting for economic policymakers to learn what you can do against such a false narrative, against fake news. It's very difficult to do anything against it.
Yeah, what's also interesting, is that Schiller, apart from trying to crystallize a theory about this, or trying at least to tell his colleagues, please, consider this narrative, he also makes a lot of examples, historical examples. And I would like to speak about two of them with you, Professor Feld, because he says, for example, there are also antinomies, like, for example, recurrence and mutation, panic versus confidence, real estate booms and busts, boycotts, profiteers, and evil business. So he says these are coming back. These are popping up in history and are influencing economy. And very often they are false narratives, or sometimes. And I thought about what you were saying now, because one chapter is the title is Frugality versus Conspicuous Consumption, which is well, in this chapter he analyzes especially the American history. So he speaks about what happened during the Great Depression when this ideology of poor is chic came out. No, so poor people were dominating, of course, in America. So he says, and there was an aesthetic and a moral coming out of this. You know, for example, about the fact that people should go around with bikes. And Schiller says this is, of course, this had consequences because people buying bikes didn't buy any more cars. So the car industry was in crisis because of this. But when I think about frugality versus consumption, I think, of course, of a very recent discussion, no? The frugal countries. Is this narrative of frugality versus consumption also, it is very strong in Europe. I mean, we spoke very often about this, Professor Feld, no?
Yeah, of course. These narratives, they are coming up again and again. So you could think about the European debt crisis in the years after 2009. There was this discussion on the Swabian housewife, which is a stereotype of frugality on the one side and the conspicuous consumption in the southern part of Europe. When you think about the metaphors created or alluded to by Hans Werner Sinn, you had this idea of people in southern Europe having party all the time at their beaches, whereas the Swabian housewife saves her money, and now we are wiring the savings of this German stereotype to the south of Europe, in particular to Greece. This was the metaphor that Hans Werner Sinn used, and so it is now again coming up in the more recent crisis that we have because of the Corona pandemic, and you have the frugal 4, actually frugal 5 if you include Finland, and the south, and again it is one part against the other, and it's quite interesting to see that such stereotypes are important in political discussions. But I would also say that, in particular, this example in Schiller's book is showing us that there is a kind of storytelling going on across several episodes in history. And it's very difficult to say that this is one narrative dominating economic outcomes. And well, as an empirical economist, I would ask, how could I test a hypothesis like that the difference between frugality and conspicuous consumption actually plays a role for the economic outcomes. Actually is meaning beyond the particular interests that we could observe in certain circumstances. So given the European debt crisis or the current situation after Corona, I would say there are strong and very hard interests behind these negotiations that are much more important than the narrative accompanying it. Yeah. So you could also question the way how Schiller draws its examples, and you see looking at ancient Greece in some examples when he begins his narrative about the narrative, so to speak. And this is somehow not fully convincing in the end. And also when you look at his closing chapter and he's saying, well, my fellow economists should use this path or another path to test something, I think this is quite difficult to do. Yeah. So I'm in the end, I'm a bit disappointed because I hoped to get a bit more insights in what Schiller thinks, what would be a good possibility of testing the impact of. And this is problematic, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think he's trying simply to invite many of his colleagues to be more interdisciplinary, like the seminar that you organized in Freiburg. But last question is about a very, very interesting and important topic, I think, which is the everlasting conflict man-machine. And this is also important because, of course, this also influences confidence. This Schiller says. So what do you think about this? There is a lot of discussion, of course, now about artificial intelligence and how it is jeopardizing jobs and creating unemployment. So where are you standing in this discussion?
Yeah, I have always argued that in the aggregate, the technical change that we can have, whether it is digitization at the moment, or whether we look at history in the Industrial Revolution, that that in the aggregate we will not have a situation in which jobs are totally lost. So the idea that we are running out of jobs because of artificial intelligence in the future, and therefore we should tax robots and should have a basic universal income for everybody. I think this story does not fit the data. When we look at in the past and find out when we had labor saving technological progress in several instances, then labor saving occurred in one sector of the economy, but new jobs were created in other sectors of the economy. And the question whether unemployment emerged due to this technical change or not depended on very much on the institutions of the labor market, how flexible it is, and how flexibly workers could go from one area of the economy to another area of the economy. And I think this can also be shown in more recent times. When you look at the evidence for the US, you have overall a significant reduction due to robots and automation and digitalization on jobs in the US economy. When you look at Germany, you don't find that. Yeah, we have overall no effect of robots, automation, and digitalization in the past on the aggregate of employment. So we see, or even a little bit more. So I was just saying this is not the robust significant effect, but in some specifications you even see a significantly higher employment overall. And therefore, I'm in this debate, I am convinced that all this technical change is finally bringing us a better economic outcome overall. And well, actually, this came up due to the massive revolutionary changes we had during the Industrial Revolution. And when you think about literature picking up outcomes of this Industrial Revolution on particular sectors of the economy, be it agriculture or whatever, or textile industry, then of course the outcome was disastrous. But the overall view of it, how important it was in creating new jobs in other areas, this was not taken by literature, and was also not taken by the media. I think media are very important in transposing particular narratives, making it more accessible to people, and therefore also making it more prevailing.
I think also, and I don't know if you are, if you agree with Schiller, but he says, for example, during the Industrial Revolution, this rhetoric of technological unemployment doesn't come up. No, there's no negative narrative about the progress taking jobs, but it comes later. It comes, I think, in the 70s, in the 80s, 70s, when there's a big Great Depression, and this Great Depression fuels, in a certain sense, the fears of machines taking man's work, man's job. So I think this is interesting that he says during the Industrial Revolution, this narrative doesn't come up. It comes up later when there's already a crisis, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. So when the crisis hits, and then someone asks, what is the reason for this crisis? Also during the Great Depression, this idea came up that technological change was a reason for the Great Depression. But what I mean is, this is usually also picked up by authors writing books, novels about certain developments. So the idea that the Industrial Revolution had a negative impact in the German discussion was due to a novel written by Gerhard Hauptmann, Die Weber, The Weaver. Yeah, and so So many people read this novel, and they finally have the impression that technological change actually leads to this negative outcome. And despite the research outcomes that we finally produce when we analyze what are the reasons for particular crises, and we come up with very different reasons, this is still prevailing. So the idea that a technological change is negative is very strong in many countries over time. And yeah, so we usually observe that this narrative comes up again and again.
We should maybe watch more movies of Eisenstein, who was the Soviet great director, a genius, and who always described this progress as something as positive. I thank you very much, Professor Feld, with this, for this discussion, interesting discussion about Robert Schiller's book. It's his latest book, Narrative Economics: How Stories Go Viral and Drive Major Economic Events. It is published by Princeton University Press, but it will be published this week in Germany. So thank you, Professor Feld, for having commended it with us, and in Italy very soon. And I want to remind you also that for the Festival of Economics will take place physically. We decided this recently. And Professor Schiller will be our guest in video, unfortunately, but he will be there, and I hope to see you soon there at the Festival of Economics, physically or virtually. And thank you all, and thank you, Professor Feld.
Yeah, thank you, Tonia, for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you for us too.